All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us at today's webinar on running effective pre-start meetings. I appreciate those of you who are dialing in live to listen to us and those who might be catching up via recording of this webinar. Thanks for being here. A little bit about Centus, who's presenting this session today. Our mission as an organisation is to change the lives of individuals and organisations for the better every day. Might sound like a fairly ambitious goal. The way that we find we're able to do that is by sharing some interesting ideas from psychology and neuroscience, in particular helping people get a bit better understanding about how this bit of kit works and the ways that it can help to drive more positive attitudes in individuals and also in creating more positive organisational safety cultures as well. With the idea or with the goal of helping more people get home to this stuff. As you'll see in the image there, we'd suggest this is what safety is really about. And that's what we help organisations with at Centus, is create this more sort of transformational and inspiring focus around what's in it for us to invest in safety. A little bit about myself. My name's Dom O'Brien, I'm Principal Consultant at Centus. Now, if you're wondering why I'm not Ben Carnell, who was originally slated to be delivering today, I'll be presenting on Ben's behalf as well, as a peer of his. So that'll be who'll be leading our session today. Now, as far as our agenda, probably something to pace out from the get-go is we did call this running effective pre-start meetings, and with some of the great questions that we received prior, many of you will have identified there's some interchangeably used terms when it comes to pre-start or pre-shift meetings. And so what we're really referring to is any of those kind of operational outcome-focused type meetings that we typically have at the beginning of a shift, for example. Sometimes we've seen the word toolbox talk be used interchangeably there as well with the same meaning. In other industries, we know that a toolbox might be a specific once weekly safety specific meeting as well. You might have even heard the idea of a safety share. Safety share is its own standalone thing, or even within the existing structure of a pre-start meeting, or even terms that are unique to specific organisations, like they might call it a tailbox talk or something like a tailgate talk. Sorry. So yeah, what we're sharing today is really applicable across each of those industries and across each of those different forums, regardless of title used. You'll find that the ideas we're sharing today are very much applicable in each of those. And probably one thing to pace out too is that we're not really focused in this session specifically about process in terms of how to structure or the information that you should necessarily be including in your specific organisation when it comes to running these meetings. What we're focused on is more about how to optimise that process, and in particular, looking at it with this lens, right? How do we help the brains of our people be more engaged through those sessions? Because, I mean, chances are, if you're on this meeting today, you're a safety professional or an operational professional in your organisation, and you may have run into that challenge that we often see, which is that these meetings don't go great. People tend not to be fully engaged with them, and they may not actually serve the intent that we put, you know, all of this time and energy as organisations in every shift, every day, in trying to get our people switched on and engaged for work. And conversely, by the same token, you may have also found examples of where you've seen either in your current or other organisations where it's done really well, and just how impactful and useful that is as a process, right? To be setting up our day and our teams for achieving the outcomes we're after and doing it safely. And so we'll look at it as well, some recommendations or some tips around that, and also really keen to hear from you all later on too. What are your learnings and experiences that you might be able to share with the group today as well? So our agenda, today we'll be covering off on a little bit of that discussion I just mentioned, you know, the intent of these meetings versus what actually tends to happen at times, and particularly why that might be going on from a brain standpoint. We'll also look at the value or the importance of planning for these meetings. You know, most of you will probably either experienced yourself or seen in other leaders that pre-starts might at times tend to be a fairly reactive kind of process, you know, where we just go and grab the run sheet or the pack and we head out and off we go. So huge opportunity to be more deliberate in the way that we do set up for these meetings as well. So we'll discuss that. Third is really critical, and this is largely focused on how do we engage the audience. It's often the part we really help organisations and leaders work on, is those delivery skills. How do we get people involved and interested in those discussions, especially when we might be finding that they can be a bit dry at times. And lastly, as I said, we'll look at some creative examples. So we've actually got a case study here we'll share with you of a particular client, but I'm sure, as we said, all of you might have some ideas we'd be able to share of what you've seen work when it comes to delivering effective pre-start meetings. So let's jump into that conversation of intent versus reality. And it's worth considering just how significant an investment these pre-shift meetings are, or toolbox meetings are, for our organisations. Now, whether operationally focused or safety exclusively, they really do represent this huge opportunity for us to get our people aligned on not only sort of the operational objectives, but also safety considerations, and even as a really great way to reinforce key culture messages. This is often the key meeting where we've got everybody assembled together, and it may be the only time where we actually even have a formal structured conversation about safety on a given shift. So really critical then that the pre-start meeting is used to its full optimized intent. So let's explore maybe what that was. Like, why did we start doing pre-start meetings originally? Obviously, there's some operational considerations, but they do represent an opportunity to influence attitudes. So what kind of mindset, what sort of frames do we want our people's brains to be going out into the workplace with today? And it might be a really good consideration for any leaders on the call too, is what sort of mindsets am I influencing in my people? What sort of attitudes am I influencing in my people's brains by what I invite them to pay attention to during a pre-start meeting as well? The second is also about the opportunity to get the crew focused and motivated. Now, in 2021, more than ever, we are absolutely bombarded with information. One of the challenges we hear our clients mention is that in setting up for these meetings, sometimes in large organisations, there is so much information through this linchpin role, that frontline leadership role at a pre-start, that we're trying to get across to our crews. It's really challenging to kind of cut through that and be able to share the critical messages that do keep a crew focused and motivated, maybe rather than getting kind of bombarded or overwhelmed with lots of information. So what's really critical to keep our crew focused and motivated, specifically on what we need to achieve this shift or today. The third idea is that it's around setting a clear direction. So one thing that we share in our programs is the brain loves to know where we're going. And often you'll see this if people don't have a clear sense of direction. If something perhaps has even changed significantly, like a change of leadership or redundancies in an organisation, people's brains are very much in threat response when they don't know where we're going. So it's a really good opportunity to set direction, and also perhaps reinforce any key cultural vision messages that you may have in the organisation during these meetings. They're also a forum for feedback and continuous improvement. So given that we've got a dedicated time in the day, this ideally should be a channel whereby we follow up any outstanding actions from the previous shift. We communicate back in response to any queries that might have come through or hazards that have been identified. And again, that's a challenge we often see when people become frustrated at a crew level with a safety culture. It's often that they feel like they took the time to provide feedback and nothing was maybe done about it. So, no faster way to disengage somebody than for them to come forward and then not get any kind of outcome or response from that. It's a really good channel to be able to seek feedback and look at how do we make it better and safer each shift. There's obviously the safety element, and an interesting thought too is we might see at times that the safety conversation becomes a separate, discrete kind of, here's the safety bit part of the pre-start meeting. And ideally where we'd encourage organisations to go is that the safety consideration should be there in all aspects. But certainly, yeah, one of the goals of a pre-start meeting is to have that safety conversation. What do we need to consider about the hazards and the risks in the work that we're doing? And lastly, it represents really a key interface between crew and leaders. You know, it may be the only time a frontline person sees a manager or superintendent, for example, and perhaps not even at every one. It's definitely a critical interface between a frontline team lead, supervisor, leading hand type role, and their crew. And so this channel is really where all the information comes from leadership to the front line. So it's absolutely critical juncture, and one that I think could be greater leveraged. So if that's kind of the goals, the result we're really after, to boil it down, and to explain this, we'll just use a model you might have seen in Centres programs before. It's called the Attitude, Behaviour and Results model. And all we're simply proposing here is that our attitude, simply the things that we think and feel about a topic, will drive our behaviours, the things that we do, and that will really influence the kind of results that we get in life. Now, the challenge with this particularly being often when we don't get a result that we're after, so we have an incident rather than safe, productive work, organisations will often go straight to behaviour and prescribe a new process, remove the hazard, put a control in place. And while vigilance, while attitudes are helpful in the short term, because, oh, geez, we had an incident, people will tend to comply, they will exhibit those behaviours. However, over time, those behaviours might drop off. And the missed opportunity here is to really tap into those attitudes, the underlying thinking and feeling that people perhaps have about risk or about safety at work. So applying this to kind of the goal of running effective pre-start meetings, ultimately we want to have safe, productive work on shift. That's the result we're chasing. And so we'd suggest some behaviours that go with that is that people are motivated for work. An outcome of the pre-start is that they're focused on task. They are risk aware. They understand the operations that are happening on site. They know the hazards they're working around. They've got effective controls in place to manage those. They are aware of them. And that they communicate effectively, particularly if things change. So they make others around them aware of something that might be different. So if they're the behaviours that we're after, we know that the underlying attitudes that need to go with that include, well, I know what's going on, I know what's expected of me, and I'm switched on to work. And really, if we want to be achieving effective pre-start meetings, that's the kind of attitudes we need to invite in our people. And so as we go through today's session, we'll be sharing some ways that we can invite those attitudes when you run these meetings. Right, so keen to get a bit of a perspective from you all on the webinar today, and would love to take a quick poll, which I'll invite Christy to fire up for us, please, now. And the question is, how would you rate the current effectiveness of your pre-starts? How would you rate the current effectiveness of your pre-starts? Now, if you don't deliver them, that's totally okay, just referring to your current organisation, or if you don't call them pre-starts, if you do a weekly toolbox or something, that's totally okay. Whatever your reference point is, please rate from a scale of not at all effective, somewhat effective, effective, very effective, or extremely effective. So for extremely effective, you'd be absolutely demonstrating the attitude, behaviour, results example we just shared, where people are coming out very focused, completely aware of what's going on, able to manage risk, and we achieve safe production each day. So we'll allow some time for that to go through. I can see quite a few of the group have voted. Just give that maybe another 20 or so seconds for people to have a say. Love to hear from you if you are on the call. Do share with us, how do you rate the current effectiveness of your pre-starts in your organisation? All right, so closing that poll out now, interestingly, a huge number, pretty half the group have rated the current effectiveness as somewhat effective. So it sounds like there's some things we're doing well already. Perhaps as we said at the beginning of today, perhaps there are some strategies, some approaches that you've found do work well, and love to hear about those later on. For the rest of the groups rating a little bit higher, so they're saying, yep, they're effective, they do what they need to do. 13% of the group saying very effective. So that's interesting that some people on this call, perhaps for you, this is more of a continuous improvement hints and tips thing. How might we go to that next iterative level of effectiveness, and for 1% of the group even extremely effective. So that's brilliant to hear that there's people out there that are not only finding this works well, but interested in learning new ideas as well. Interesting though, yeah, for 57% overall of the group, we'd say there's probably room for improvement, right? And you're not alone. You're absolutely not alone. So in fact, in our research, we found when we do safety culture diagnostics, in particular our safety climate survey, if you look at that data set across almost 12,000 respondents, 51% of employees describe their team safety meetings as a poor to average experience. And so this is kind of understandable, right? You know, if we think about what are the drivers for doing these things, at times they can become a bit of a tick box exercise. And so we might actually miss leveraging the real value of taking the time to have these meetings. But it also represents, on the plus side, this represents a huge opportunity for improvement, right? What if we were to start moving towards people describing these as being effective or extremely effective? So why do they fall short? Well, we'd suggest there's kind of 4 typical areas where we see the interactions and the behaviours not achieve the engagement or the input that we're hoping with these meetings. So the first would be presenteeism, and if you're probably familiar with that term in organisations where someone's sort of there physically, but they're checked out mentally, they're not actually present. And so as a result, in a pre-start meeting, this could be, you know, those few people at the back of the room that are there with their arms folded and they've got the dark sunnies on and the hard hat on or whatever, and they're kind of in the room, but you know that they're completely tuned out. They might even have an earbud in one ear or be chatting to the person next to them. And so they're not really actually participating. They're kind of filling in the time to be present at this meeting, but not actually engaging in any way. And in terms of a cultural maturity, you'd probably say, this is kind of public compliance. I've got to be seen to be here, but I'm not actually involved in any way. The second would be around having a passive audience. And this is one of the real challenges we see with leaders getting the group involved, in that people are there and they're kind of, you know, they're paying attention, they're looking, but they're not actually going to contribute. And in fact, there might even be this kind of culture of, oh, you know, you don't want to be the one person to bring up a suggestion or follow up a hazard report that you put in, because that's going to delay us getting on with the job and we're already behind. And so the culture could be in those pre-start meetings that people just kind of go, yep, yep, yep. Does everyone understand what we're doing? Yep. And away we go. And there's not that more meaningful conversation. You'd also potentially say that a lot of the time the delivery is not very engaging, so that the typical standard we see would be that leader with a clipboard, or, you know, they've got the run sheet up the front of the group, they're standing, everybody else is kind of sitting around. Some people might even be obscured, and they're just reading off a sheet. And, you know, you put yourself in the shoes of the person receiving that, that's not really a highly engaging experience. And the last is where we might move into the idea of complacency or performance drift. So perhaps especially when organisations feel like things are going well, or crews feel like, you know, we haven't had an incident for a while, we might sort of go off a little bit off script. So if you do have a pre-start process that maybe you used to talk about what went well last shift, we've kind of moved away from that, and now we don't do that anymore, and no one really knows why. It just kind of fell off the radar. So that's a bit of an example of how you can get this drift away from an agreed process or a standard of delivery that previously used to be higher, and people may not notice that slow change. So what does good look like then, if these are some of the reasons why things fall over? We'd suggest that an effective pre-start needs to be really well structured. So if you are finding that there isn't a structure for your pre-starts, recommend to you that you do consider it. Certainly, like a lot of behavioural approaches with safety do prescribe like a visual management board or a way of kind of working through, you know, what operations are happening today, anything happening simultaneously, what hazards do we need to be aware of, getting the group to identify those, what went well last shift, all of those kind of things. So setting up a bit of a structure particularly, and that includes the preparation that goes with that. So that implies that, hey, some work needs to be done prior to showing up, that we need to put some meaningful thought into what we want to discuss. That it's relevant. I can share with you an example where I've seen a client with a big muster hall of probably over 120 workers, talking about everything that's happening at site today. And yes, it's probably useful to be aware if there's anything that impacts my specific area, but for a lot of those people, they were tuned out. That, you know, they're staring at their boots and really not taking anything in at all. And it really was the fact that most of that information, when we spoke to them, they said wasn't relevant for their work area. Didn't make a difference to how they would do their work that day. So considering what information is relevant for your people to know, and then once you know that, be really concise with it. You know, an idea that we share in our programs is this amazing piece of equipment only has about 7 units of conscious attention. We can only hold a small amount of data in our mind at any given time, and we'll miss things. So oftentimes the amount of information that comes through in a pre-start is just not brain friendly. So the opportunity is, could we be more concise? What do people absolutely have to know? And can you say it in a shorter, more pointed way that would really get it across just as clearly and more likely to stick, more likely to be remembered later on? Do we integrate information? And what I mean by this is, do we follow through on an incident that was raised yesterday, or have we linked to a key message that's coming from management that we need to discuss with the team? Rather than perhaps just focusing on what's the message I need to communicate today, that we're actually linking to ways of communicating with, say, the previous shift, for example, or onto the next shift. And that leads into as well the idea that we might be able to communicate messages cross-team and site-wide. So anything that's really important to know, it could be that there's been a near miss on one of the other shifts, or even at another site within your complex, for example. What could we learn from that, and that we're communicating that information and the learnings from that as to what does that mean for us when we go on shift today? That they are delivered effectively. And this is probably one of the huge opportunity areas. You know, not many people really love the idea of being up in front of a group or public speaking, but it is such a critical aspect. And the good news is too, is leaders don't have to do it by themselves. One of the big opportunities is to actually engage your team in owning and helping deliver this stuff, so that it's not just, you know, the leader giving the information. You know, another example I'll share with you is, I had a client where on one side of the muster hall, there was like a big line, visible line on the floor, and the leaders stood on that side and the team stood on this side about 10 meters away from them in a big group. And you could just tell that, like, you know, the delivery wasn't there. People weren't really fully engaged with that. And it actually had a bit of a symbolic kind of distancing effect of leaders versus teams, which was interesting. We'll come to being aware of kind of your physical space in delivering these a little bit later on. They need to be responsive and flexible. Sorry. So, for example, you know, if you typically have a meeting outside and it's raining, for example, would you be willing to, you know, jump in the cab of a four-wheel drive or a vehicle in order to still be able to have that meeting? You know, that if things change or something comes up, we're able to respond rather than feel like we're in a really rigid approach to these meetings, because that's more likely to invite a compliance only tick and flick type attitude. And lastly, that they are safe operation focused. So I mentioned that before, that we don't just sort of talk about the work to be done and then we do the safety bit. When we're talking about the work to be done, that we do have a focus on safe operations. So how are we going to do the work? Yes, that's important. How are we going to achieve the output or the outcome? But how are we going to do it safely as well? And that's what we'd suggest is where it's well integrated, that safety is not an afterthought. So I mentioned before about the critical role of planning and about why this is such an important part of delivering effective pre-starts. A little quote here from George S. Clason, which says, "Opportunity wastes no time on those who are unprepared." So if we're going to put all of this time and energy into creating a space to convey really critical messages, let's not forget the why we're doing it in the first place. Ultimately, we want to connect with this goal of helping set our teams up for success. And why do we want to do that? So that they can all go home safely at the end of the shift. So the opportunity here being, yeah, do we take that chance to fully utilize the time that we have, rather than just making it a checkbox exercise? So some tips for planning. Firstly, that can we keep it short and simple? So the point before was around what's concise. You know, you might have 8 memos and a couple of other safety alerts, or, you know, something else from another site that you need to convey, plus the, you know, the weekly memo or something that needs to go out. Spend the time, if that's your role, spend the time seeing if you can cull that down, seeing if you can take and highlight the key messages. Even if you are only spend 10 minutes prior to shift, investing a bit of time in doing that, the familiarity and the confidence you can take then to the team in keeping those messages short, punchy, and brain friendly will go a long way to making sure that they take away the stuff that they really do need to know. So that's, again, keeping it in mind that we can only process a small amount of information at any one time, and that the more concise you can keep it without obviously missing any key messages will be effective. Sticking to the information that's absolutely relevant to the team. So you might want to pass the filter through of that, of going, what do my team absolutely know? What are the key messages that need to be shared? You might even want to write out key points as a bit of a reminder. So you could even say, guys, there's only 3 things that you absolutely do need to take away from today. It's A, B, and C, and I'm going to even write them up on the board. And you might have heard of the idea of the primacy and recency effects on the brain. Primacy being we tend to remember the things that came first in the message, and recency meaning that we tend to remember the things that came most recently or last in the message. So you might start with, here's the 3 things, that's your primacy, and at the end you follow up with, here are the 3 things. And I've also tapped into the visual medium by writing it up on a board so that people can have that reinforced in their brain. And the idea that we might link, reinforce, repeat. So often with the things like organizational values or a safety vision, those sorts of things, these meetings are a key channel, an ideal channel for us to be reminding and reinforcing those messages, and also making links to them. You know, when we go through all of that stuff in a toolbox talk, do we actually start with, why are we telling you all this information about how to manage that particular hazard or how to work in a confined space? Why? Because we really care about you going home safely to the things that matter. And so starting with that, making the link of, you know, how does this practice help us, will support people's engagement. So if you can plan those links and be aligned to those messages prior to sharing it with the team, that will certainly help. Now, here's some of the interesting skills that we talked about earlier about how do we engage our audience. And certainly some of the pre-webinar questions we got were very much aimed at this. How do you keep people engaged, or how do you deal with off-topic responses, you know, going down a rabbit hole where someone's, you know, asked something unhelpful or brought up a topic that wasn't part of the conversation. So we'll jump into that. Briefly, 5 key considerations about facilitation. Number 1 being, consider those non-verbals. It could be, what's your space and position in the room? Where you can be, if you're facilitating or leading this, front and center is absolutely the place that you want to be. And also be thinking about the space, the environment that you're in. Is it a noisy and loud environment? Do you need to consider about finding another area that's going to give people's brains a greater ability to pay attention? Am I looking to be making eye contact with people and ensuring that the room is set up in a way that people can't avoid eye contact? So ideally, we'd encourage you for standing meetings. We find that tends to work best. It's only sort of 10, 15 minutes. We're asking people to be on their feet, but you will find that helps with engagement and participation. It also give you a little bit better visual of kind of who's in the space, so that people can't perhaps, you know, hide behind one another. The second then is around active listening. So you've probably heard that idea. Really simply, this is where we are actually making eye contact, giving those small little visual cues that we're paying attention, like we nod along, or, you know, we might give an acknowledgement, or even those little, like, yeah, okay, tell me more, or what do you, yep, keen to hear more from you on that. And yeah, so active listening is a really great way of demonstrating to people that their participation in the meeting is appreciated, because you are really engaged with that. And also keeping an eye out for where it's not happening. You might even want to find a technique you can use is to move into that space. So if you're typically just standing at the front of the room and you know that there's a group at the back who aren't fully engaged, they're not actively listening, move into that space and you'll find that is a subtle cue for them to pay more attention. Thirdly, you can use really effective questions. So we know that the brain loves to answer questions. It's hardwired to do so. And in fact, the quality of the answers we get is really determined by the quality of the questions that we ask. So the answer to questions like, how are we going to get our production target back up, or how are we going to get the shutdown finished today, comes with a certain set of answers, which generally are rushing production outcome type answers. To nuance that, all you'd need to say is, how are we going to achieve that safely today? And all of a sudden their brain is paying attention to a different set of information simply by asking a different question. So effective questions is a really powerful way. Start considering what questions do you ask and how much telling versus asking do you do in your pre-start meetings. In terms of influencing participation, we'll share some strategies with you in a moment that can help to do that, and as well ways of managing challenges too. So another brain fact we'll share with you is that much like a torch beam, our brain can only truly focus on one task at a time. As a result, we are easily distracted. Now you might be saying, yeah, Dom, but how come we can drive a car and talk on the phone at the same time? You've got a powerful subconscious brain, which is able to do even complex tasks like driving a car. But unfortunately, we can't consciously do both at the same time. You'll see that if that person has to change lanes in traffic, all of a sudden that conversation you'll find will stop, and their torch beam will go focused onto the driving of the car. So helping your people really understand that there is that limitation is pretty critical, and we need to be aware that people's attention is limited. We need to make our messaging brain friendly. And we need to manage distractions. So we can manage visual and auditory distractions. That was about considering your location, as we mentioned, minimizing sort of activity or foot traffic that's happening around the space in which you do your pre-starts. Or if it's unavoidable, keep it really short and punchy. You might have plant or machine noise around you. Bring the group in close and focus just on the key takeaway messages to convey to them in that moment. Also need to manage internal distractions. People may have things going on at home. So we might want to acknowledge that, people, if they seem distracted or if they seem like there's other things happening, at the moment, I'm sure for a lot of us, COVID could be a potential distraction for us, might be on our minds. So you might want to reinforce to the group about what's in our control here. There could be many things happening on shift or many challenges that we're up against in terms of achieving our goal. But we can bring the group back to asking a helpful question, which is what's important now. The what's important now question helps refocus that torch beam of our brain with the limited attention we have on the things that are most critical in the moment. On any given day, many things will be important, but very few things are important right now. And that's why it's a really effective tool to use with your team to help them remain focused. Another thing that's helpful to know about the brain, and particularly in the way we share information, is our brain pays attention to things that are dippy. So we share this in our safety programs at centres, but dippy stands for dangerous, important, pleasurable, and interesting. And your brain will pay attention in that order. So things that are pleasurable will always beat things that are just interesting. Things that are important will always beat things that are just pleasurable. Things that are dangerous should always get our attention. However, one thing to know about your brain is it's highly energy efficient. And even if it sees danger, if nothing bad happens, it will tend to fall off over time. You probably won't pay as much attention to that danger. So an example being, if you've had an incident at site recently, one of the team had a laceration or a crush injury, that will be really front of mind. It will be very dippy for the team. But what happens over 6 months to a year? People tend to sort of become a bit complacent, right? Well, nothing bad's happened now. Not because we're bad people, we don't care about safety, but because from a brain standpoint, hey, nothing bad's happened. I've only got limited energy. I'll pay attention to something that's more dippy right now to me. So it's helpful to know that that's kind of how your people's brains pay attention. And in ways that we can make it more dippy for our people and manage distractions is by being genuine. So we said before about investing that time in planning. It's so important that you are behind the message that you're giving. If you're demonstrating as a leader that you don't really know what this thing's about, then your people will probably get the sense that this isn't so important. Or if you're giving messages that, oh guys, I'm only sharing this with you because management have come up with this new policy and we have to do it. Well, that's a gentle invitation for them not to care, right? So it's really important, whatever filter you put through, that you are genuine, that you do know your content, or if you don't know it, own it. Say, look, I'm not sure what the answer is, or I can't give you an answer on that. give me some time, I'll go and ask the question, or I'll follow up for you. So own what you don't know. That's a really key piece. Don't have to have all the answers. Believing in your message. So if you do have, a key message around safety or a vision, connect with that yourself rather than there's might be a tendency to just kind of repeat the thing we have to say. People will know if that's not authentic. So connecting with it and believing in your in the message that you're sharing, and try not to just read from a sheet of information. If you can get across the info and paraphrase it, play it back yourself, even if it means investing that 10, 15 minutes, you'll find that'll go a long way to people really connecting with your message. Second is around using humor and stories. So tapping into the important, pleasurable, and interesting aspects of the DIPI criteria. Particularly when we're sharing safety messages, the tendency is we're going to focus on danger, 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 danger. Here's the hazard. Here's the thing that will hurt you. Here's the risk. And people can sort of tune off or tune out to that after a while. Cool opportunity is to tap into the important, pleasurable, and interesting aspects. So how could we get people's attention? And humor and stories are a great way to do that. So you might tell a personal anecdote, or maybe something silly that you did in your younger years, or even like a video of some DIY disasters, home renovations, or things like that, where you might be able to get the team's attention a little bit through making it lighthearted. The trick then is to make a link to the story that you want to make. So not just sharing it because it's fun and interesting. That'll be a great way to fill in time, but making the link to what's the key message that we want to take from that. Also getting the crew involved. So often there's a tendency to do all the telling. The stereotype is the leader at the front with the clipboard doing all the talking. Here's what's happening on shift today. Get the crew involved, invite them to lead that process. You're going to invite their ownership and participation through doing so. And they've probably got some interesting ideas around how you might make your pre-start meetings more DIPI as well. Get them involved. They might share their own stories or some examples or case studies that they've seen. The other piece is use questions. Be willing to not have all the answers. Draw on the team. They're the experts. They're the ones out there doing the work every day. They're going to have plenty of ideas for you. And lastly, use of tokens. So tokens is a concept we use, which just simply means a unit of acknowledgement, a way of acknowledging someone, which could be as simple as a non-verbal, or it could be saying a job well done for a specific task. So your people will be looking to the things that get attention from the leaders or get attention during a meeting like a pre-start. And so it's important that we don't just address by exception where things aren't going right, that we also acknowledge and reward the things that are going well. And if you want to invite more involvement, give big tokens for when people participate. Thanks so much for sharing your opinion, or great idea, I'm glad you brought it forward. So it's also a good forum to give feedback and recognition. Now, as we said before, things will fall off your DIPI radar over time. What was dangerous before we become complacent to. So you need to be aware that you've got to keep mixing it up, and it's not just the job of the person or the leader to come up with new and creative ideas all the time. This is where we can lean into the team, and their engagement will help keep the pre-start meeting DIPI. So some things that you might focus on if you want to keep it DIPI. Keeping up with current affairs and news events that you could link to. So that was the idea before. If there was an incident or a case study or something that you've read maybe from the industry that you want to link to or talk about with the group, that'll be fairly DIPI. You could look at what other industries are doing and take learning from them. We've had plenty of discussions around sort of high reliability industries and how they look at error management, for example, which could make for a really good discussion. You might want to bring a topic that has a personal example for you, or the impact that it might have had. It could have been something that you did on the weekend, or a behavior you observed when you were driving the car on the highway. Those sort of things can bring it to life, definitely. It might even be not just that sort of physical safety, but how are you looking after your well-being and mental health? What was something that you did on the weekend to invest in being fully fit for work and having your brain fully focused on shift this week? Try to think of safety wins rather than fails. It's often easy to focus on the things that aren't going right, but if we want to role model and show what good looks like, we can also share with our people where safety's gone really well. That could take the form of an after-action review. You know, we just did a shutdown, or we just did a particular shift in the equipment underground. Nobody got hurt. Well done. We achieved the outcome. How did we do that? So focusing on the wins, or sharing some interesting stats or recent research. You know, there's plenty of stuff out there on the internet. You can spend a few minutes grabbing something to bring to the team as part of your preparation process too. Now, what if we get curveballs? I'd love to hear from the group, please. If you could type into the chat section, what are the things that can derail pre-starts? What are the things that you've seen? And I think one of the ones that was sent through was, what happens when someone starts talking and quizzing the presenter and tries to run them down a rabbit hole? So that's a perfect example of a derailer. Absolutely. What other things are you seeing? Please type them in the chat box. We'd love to hear from you. Things that could derail a pre-start. Great, I can see a few coming through. So industrial relations issues, absolutely, yep. So if people have got those things on their mind about if you're in the middle of an enterprise agreement negotiation, or there might be union stuff going on, that can tend to be something of a distraction. Thanks for those. Money queries, yeah, absolutely, that'll be on people's minds. That's fairly dippy. Yeah, the lockdown and the implications of the ever-changing COVID regulations, that's a great example. Certainly will be on people's minds. Breakdowns, yep, that'll can tend to stop work or create a lot of questions about what next. Asking questions so the presenter can't get a word in, okay? So just sort of peppering you without actually listening for a response. Unplanned interactions, distractions, and phone calls. Yeah, that's a huge one at the moment, isn't it? Team member impacted personally. Yep, cynical comments, negative comments. Yep, a lot of those kind of derailing behaviours that people have when they sort of want to have a chip at someone or express their frustration with the organisation. Changes at the last minute, not paying attention, being on their phone. Yeah, that's absolutely one that often happens. Great. So it sounds like you're all pretty familiar then with the kind of things that we might see that derail it. So let's share some ways that we might deal with those off-topic responses or comments. So this can be about keeping things on track. So when the group begins to talk about issues that are not relevant to the discussion, you might take advantage of a pause and say, look, I hear what you're saying. Can we finish that conversation at another time, or can we talk more about that after the pre-start meeting's finished? So I'd encourage you to be brave in these moments and actually call it. If there is something that's not on topic or it's derailing, call it. Say, look, my understanding is that we're going to be having a conversation about this. I hear what you're saying. I'm going to park that for the moment. Can we return to the topic? Doesn't necessarily mean that they're always going to react favorably to that, but I think most people will understand that if you've been clear about what the topic and the agenda is from the get-go, you're more likely to be able to return to that and honour it if it does go off track. So being willing to call it and lead the meeting in that way when you do hear that things are going off track, to challenge and say, look, my understanding is what we're focused on at the moment is this. Could we return to that later? Could be a way of dealing with that. And a parking lot's a really good way around that, so that people don't maybe feel fobbed off or disregarded. It's important where people are participating that we want to keep that engagement. You might form, if you've got a visual management board or even a notebook in your pocket that you want to write up that parking lot, ideally it's somewhere that they can see it and know that there's an accountability to follow that up. You might want to use that as a strategy where people are bringing up other topics for discussion, which again, some of them will be really pertinent where it's, you know, about an EA negotiation or pay. That stuff's not going to go away. Let's acknowledge it, but park it. What about if you get a quiet group? Well, this is where people are sort of sat back, not contributing. And perhaps they don't, you know, oftentimes in cultures, you don't want to be the one to speak up, or the crew just wants to get on with the work, and having an in-depth discussion slows that down. So using tokens to reinforce where people do speak up or contribute, even if it's something that's not necessarily helpful, that might be off topic, you go, look, thanks for contributing, do appreciate your perspective. What I'd like to focus on, or I'd like to hear from someone else. Has anyone else got an idea? And that way you might actually be able to target the people that you'd like to hear from. You might even say, Steve, what's your perspective on this? Or Sally, I'd like to hear from you as to how you see it. And that way you can draw out a little bit more of the individual participants' contributions, particularly if you know that they're the kind of person who might say something separately but not in the group setting. Be conscious of minimizing blunt corrections. You know, if there's no surer way to reduce people's likelihood to contribute if you tell them they're wrong, or if you just straight up say no, or that was a stupid idea. People are less likely to then come back and contribute. So we might acknowledge, not necessarily, if it's not necessarily a helpful response, thanks for sharing your view on that. Or I'd like to talk about this today though. I'd like us to focus on this in the meeting, or could we hear from someone else and get their perspective? And be aware of the 8 to 10 second rule. So you might have heard the idea of being comfortable with silence. It's an excellent technique to use in pre-start meeting. In a social setting, our social brain will be feeling that sort of uncomfortable quietness. If you're happy to sit in and wait, people will be more likely to speak up and contribute, if nothing else than to break the silence, right? So being comfortable with that, putting the question to the group and being willing to wait till you get an answer. You might be a fair way along in terms of your thinking about the topic, but you might be introducing it to your people's brains for the first time. Let's give them some time to process so that they can think through their answer before they respond, and allowing that time is a great way of doing that. If we get dominating or derailing behavior, again, we can use tokens. Look, I appreciate your comments, but I want to hear a different perspective. We can expand the focus, so we can make direct eye contact with other members of the audience and invite their participation, what they think. And lastly, as we said before, we can use that parking lot. So, okay, I hear that that's really important to you. I know that you'd like to discuss, look, let me parking lot that and we'll revisit it tomorrow or after the meeting, those sorts of things. So I'd love to hear from people on the call too. What's some creative examples that you've seen? What are some situations or pre-starts or even toolboxes where you've seen people tap into maybe some of those other dippy things? Did they make it important, pleasurable, or interesting through using an example or doing an activity or those sorts of things? So love to, if you could type it into the chat box, share with us what are some creative examples that you've seen in your travels, in your careers. Love it, thanks for that. So a rugby ball with safety related questions on it, which is thrown to participants. Yeah, nice, okay, I like that. So passing it around, using questions to prompt people's thinking. Excellent. Use of a show and tell type example. Yeah, so that's a great way of engaging at a crew level. And you might even do that on rotation, whereby each person has to bring a new thing to discuss for the week. And the skill will then be in, can we make those safety links, or can we make those safe production links to that, to what's been shared. Mark, I will acknowledge that. Definitely, workers tend to increase their attention when they see an esky brought into the room. That tends to get people involved. Sure, I wonder whether their torch beams focused on the pre-start or focused on the esky at that point. But it's a great idea, and you might have seen the idea of having a barbecue or something like that as a way of socializing and tapping into that dippy idea. So that people sort of see the connection between the important, pleasurable, and interesting stuff, particularly if we might want to have a focus on safety. Some other great ideas, asking the team what they think. Yeah, couldn't recommend that more strongly, is the use of questions and being willing to go to the group for their suggestions and ideas. Changing each day, definitely. It might take a little bit of investment and guidance and coaching in the short term, but getting your people up to a place where they can lead that process comfortably is a really good idea. Yeah, great. So the example of using, bringing in household cleaning chemicals and showing as an example of, rather than talking about abstract ideas of hazardous chemicals, using real life household sort of ones that'll be close to home for most. Asking the person raising the question what they think we could do. Yeah, fantastic. So putting it to them and even potentially to the group. You know, often in that moment when we get that curly question or someone challenging us, we might feel the urge to pick up the rope and have a strong answer to come back at them with. When in actual fact, you can totally diffuse that by putting the question back to them in the group. So, well, what do you feel would be a fair response to that, or team, what do you think we ought to do in response to that? can be a really great way of shifting that sense that we've got to have all the answers as the leaders, to using effective questions to draw on the team as well. Thanks for sharing those. Those are really good. Check them out in the questions pane if you haven't already. And then lastly, just wanted to share with you an example, a client example that we've done, where we've got a process of engaging with the client on their existing deployment process, so their pre-shift process that they use. And they have a visual management board that they use that they sort of used as a structure around which to lead this conversation. So it has the month, calendar days of the month there. You're able to use a color-coded system to show where there were safety improvements, where they had a safe shift or an unsafe shift, and that was measured against injury. And also a discussion using questions, right? So what went well? Taking that continuous improvement mindset. What did we learn? Any key hazards reported, anything requiring escalation follow-up, and any information to share. So this is just simply providing a framework around which all of those recommendations we suggested before could be done. You'll see we've got that attitude behavior results there. So getting people to reflect on, well, if we did have a safe shift, why? What did we do well that actually contributed to that? There's also, and these were done as magnets on a big 2.4 meter by 1.2 meter magnetic whiteboard. And so the team could actually have a bit of discretion in terms of shuffling these things around, or even removing things that they didn't particularly want to focus on. So there were options of, a safety topic to focus on for the day, task allocations, what people were going to be doing operationally. There could be a shout out recognition thing. So you might link to values or even specific safety behaviors that we want to see. So that's kind of a prompt to invite leaders to be acknowledging that stuff. Managing our gorillas, that's a term that centres use for those things that we might miss due to our brain limitations. And so getting people to be risk focused. What are the key dangers we need to manage today? What do we need to make important? Any distractions, any simultaneous ops we need to factor in, all of those sorts of things. So you can see as a process, that was a way of doing that, and people could remove different sections of the board if they wanted to. And then of course, going with all of that needs to come the skills to deliver that well. So we spent some time with those leaders on exactly the things we've shared with you today, which is how do you manage derailing behavior? How do you position yourself in a room and set up for success? What are some ways that you can use active listening and effective questioning to drive people's engagement? And then this is just the second side of that board as to what it looked like. So to wrap up, just like to share with you a bit of a summary of the things that we've covered. And these are in the form of questions that you might want to take away from today as self-reflection ones, or ones that you might share with the organisation to start thinking about how will we improve or create more effective pre-start meetings. So are they brief, well-structured and concise? Do your workers find them relevant or useful? Easy way to tell will be the level of engagement and participation and the body language. Is there enough emphasis on ensuring adequate planning prior to the briefings and prior to starting work? Or is it okay to just kind of grab the sheet and rock up on the day and read from the sheet? Or are we actually asking a bit more of our people? Are you encouraging two-way communication during pre-start, or does it tend to be a bit of a stand and deliver type approach? Do you use them as an opportunity to discuss improvements, lessons learned, and to close out items raised in previous meetings, and even to welcome that when people do raise it? Great, we do want to hear from our people on this stuff, and we've got a way of documenting, for example, an outstanding hazard action. Are your pre-starts engaging enough to make safety discussions relevant and interesting? It's the challenging part. It won't remain dippy forever. Let's tap into our people and get them involved to keep it important, pleasurable, and interesting, not just dangerous. And do you use them as an opportunity to recognise attitudes and behaviours you want to see? It's one of the biggest challenges we find for leaders, is the ability to reward and recognise positive safety behaviours and the opportunity to link to an overall vision too. So that's our summary checklist. We'd commend to you in terms of a takeaway from today, but we'd love to hear any other questions that people might have to close out the day. So please start firing those through if you do have any. And I wanted to follow up one really interesting question that we had submitted prior. where Luke asked, how would you adapt your recommendations to business context with culturally and linguistically diverse workforces? For example, in cultures with a greater weight of collective versus individual, which is a really good question, Luke. So, you know, we've often delivered programs in different countries and cultures. And the suggestion would be getting to know your people as best you can. Often where it's culturally diverse, that can be a challenge. But one thing we've found really resonates universally is getting to know people's personal big five, or the things that they want to go home safe to today. That's pretty universal. I've been in the mountains of Papua New Guinea with the Nationals there, and very much it's a lot of the same stuff, right? That resonates with us. And if we can connect to that as the why, there's even opportunities to link to a collectivist type mindset, which is do it for your family because your family needs you to continue to support them, for example, or being willing to challenge our peers because we care about them in that sort of collectivist mindset. So yeah, I'd agree that it can be a challenge, but that's a really interesting point to raise about how do we tap into that. I've got some other questions. Margot, how can we avoid the tick the box effect of reiteration of everyday safety messages? That's a great point, Margot. My suggestion there would be just to consider how we're going about that. If we tend to just keep saying the message, I wonder, is there an opportunity to connect with what that means for our people? Why should they be motivated about that? You know, if we're saying zero harm is our goal, well, what does that realistically and literally mean for our people? So connecting with the things that they're coming to work for, to work safely for, is potentially a way of bringing that to life for them, rather than just saying, hey, our vision is zero harm or our mission is zero harm. That can get a bit lost, I think. Linking it with what's important to people, and if you don't know, ask them. Go and get to know your people and find out about what are they working in the organisation for? What are they staying safe for? Right, so folks, just conscious of time, I'm going to just share with you, if you did want to find out more about the process around that, in terms of how would we address pre-shift processes, please fire off if you wanted to, an expression of interest, so you can vote if you do want to hear more about our pre-shift process or targeted skills-based training. So all of those opportunity areas we mentioned before, expressing your interest. I also noticed that Joanne's just asked, could we put this last summary slide up for a minute? Yeah, what I might actually do, Joanne, is we can even share those slides available to everyone if you did want to come back and grab any of those checklist items again in the future. Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. Yep, slides can be available for sure. Thanks for your feedback. That's good to hear. Yep, excellent. Thanks, Lisa. Yep, yeah, we'll do. That's great. Great. Thanks for those who have done an expression of interest on that, finding out a bit more about that approach with pre-starts and toolbox talks. The other one I'd put to the group too, just if you wanted to find out a bit more about the Zip Essentials program, as in all of that stuff we talked about from how the brain works, we've got an online e-learning module that goes with that, yeah, if you wanted to look at how that would support your organisation and engaging your people's brains when it comes to safety, that's our e-learning module that shares all of that information. So if that's of interest, we can do a complimentary trial for you as a link to this webinar. All right, lastly, just wanted to say a big thank you to everybody who joined live on the call and those who will be listening back later on. Really appreciate your engagement and interest in the topic, right? It's one of those ones that I think is a bit of a bugbear for people, so I trust that some of the information shared today is useful. The other thing I'd offer too is please connect if you'd like to discuss more, if you've got other questions based on today's session, or feel like maybe I didn't get to everybody's questions and you wanted to follow up, love to hear from you. That's my email address, or you can find me on LinkedIn as well, pretty readily found there. And love to hear from you. Hope to speak to you soon. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining us at today's webinar.